Welcome to the sort of second presentation that I was going to give for nutrition. This one is going to cover P3M1, so we're starting to move on to energy balance. And so I'm sort of trying to roughly follow the order that's within the workbooks, but also try and cover some key points that people working from the assignment planners might find useful. I'm going to split this energy balance section into two bits really. One is just sort of introductory concepts, and the second bit is a little bit more about working with sort of measurements and amounts of energy being used in different sports. So this is only sort of 15 slides. I'll try and sort of scoot through it as quickly as I can. So the criteria we're working for here, we're finally working towards a merit criteria. So describing energy intake and expenditure in sports performance, and explaining that energy intake and expenditure in sports performance. So with the explanations, you're just giving sort of slightly more detail, you're giving more examples, and just sort of really sort of taking time to explain to the reader these different concepts. So we're going to sort of work our way through a lot of this sort of unit content that's listed here. We'll get down to about we'll get down to about here. So we'll cover all of this. Some of it can be sort of quite brief, because I think the really deeper stuff is coming down, looking at sort of energy balance during physical activity and the effect of energy balance on sports performance. So off we go. So first thing, we look at what energy is. So I don't know if you've ever had this at school, but I've got a little picture on the right hand side of someone burning a food stuff at school. We burnt a peanut. Look at me colouring it in and making it red and yellow. So ultimately, what's quite surprising, if you ever take time to burn a peanut, is how long it burns for. And so if you look at energy in the sense of, essentially what it's doing is it's transferring, in this case, this sort of energy contained within the peanut into heat. So one way of measuring the energy content of food is by measuring how long it burns effectively. So energy we define as calories, and there's a really good definition in your course book, page 169, which I encourage you to look at. But an actual calorie is the amount of energy required to raise a volume of 1 gram of water by 1 degree, and this is sort of if it sort of starts around 15 degrees. A kilocalorie is the amount of energy required to raise 1 litre, 1 kilogram of water, 1 degree from around 15 degrees. So you can imagine, if I've got let's say a peanut in its sort of size there, that has a lot of energy. They're very energy dense. There's quite a lot of fat in them. But a similar volume of something like, let's say, bread is going to burn for much less time. So you can sort of see where the kind of calorie link comes. So calorie is really our unit of energy we tend to use. It should be kilocalories really, but we tend to refer to the sort of energy density of food as being from the kilocalorie. So on the left hand side here, I've got the nutritional information for a McDonald's shake. So what you can see, if I just colour this in orange, the energies here is in kilocalories. This is our sort of British way of looking at energy. So it has 488 kilocalories of energy. So that's roughly the equivalent of about 2 pints of beer, again, maybe sort of, I'm trying to think what else that is, maybe a couple of Mars bars perhaps. It's quite a chunk of calories. That's probably just a little bit lower than a Big Mac in terms of calories from that shake. You'll see above it, I'm just going to colour it in blue, we have the energy expressed as a kilojoule, and this is a much more sort of international metric way of expressing energy. We'll look at those in a minute, but they're essentially measuring the same thing. kilojoules are roughly 4.2 calories, so on most food labels you'll see the two things together. We in Britain tend to use the kilocalorie, but often people say calories when they mean kilocalories. So next step. So this is sort of a quick overview of this sort of joules versus calories business. So the thing that I just mentioned, so up here, if they say calories are units of energy, 1 calorie is the amount of energy required to heat 1 gram of water by 1 degree centigrade. So this is in a sort of sealed container. A scientist will burn the product and see how how effective it is at raising the temperature of some water in a test tube. A kilocalorie is just the sort of, oh sorry, wrong one there. A kilocalorie, let me just rub that out. A kilocalorie is equivalent to 1,000 calories. So it's the amount of energy required to raise a kilo or a litre of water by that same 1 degree at 15 degrees. So from a sort of energy perspective, we need to sort of suggest that our food calories is a unit of energy. So we also have this concept of joules. So joules is not something we tend to use an awful lot in nutrition. They're a very small unit of work, basically. So 1 joule is the amount of work required to produce 1 watt of power for 1 second. It can also be used in electricity. Again, it's a sort of another sort of slight measure of heat, actually. We tend to use kilojoules. So again, this is the sort of the kind of metric equivalent. It's 1,000 joules, and 1 calorie is equivalent to 4.2 kilojoules. So on the right hand side, you might just, let me just pop it in a blue. Can you see that in there? I'm just popping it on there. So this is from a bag of Haribo. So 1,472 kilojoules, and that's 346 kilocalories. So very similar sort of measurements, or sort of very similar way of expressing the measurements. It's just the kilojoules is the sort of maybe sort of more modern metric way of expressing energy, and kilocalories is a sort of slightly older version. So calories are tend to use the measure of energy of food, whereas the unit of kilojoule is used in a wide range of sources. So things like electrical energy, you also use sort of chemical energy in food, and various other sort of applications. So generally we go off this kilocalories. So when we do our diet planning later on, we'll look at how many kilocalories a person will be needing or requiring to sort of fuel their sport and activity, and we'll be expressing our diet plans relative to kilocalories. But if you're reading labels, that kilojoules is always going to be there. So all you need to know is 1 calorie is about 4.2 kilojoules, and they're measuring pretty much the same thing. So we look at this concept of energy expenditure and intake. So energy intake is basically anything we take into our body, any sort of food and drink, anything that contains calories. Everything that we ingest really will give us sort of intake, will allow us to intake calories into our body. Our energy expenditure depends on a number of things. So our basal metabolic rate is something that we'll look at in the second lecture that I'll do. So this basically is the amount of calories that we burn at rest. So just to sort of keep us alive, to keep us warm, to keep our brain functioning. Our brain needs about something like 300 or 400 calories a day. Things like energy to allow the respiratory muscles, our lungs to work, our heart to beat, everything that just keeps us alive. We add on to that physical activity. So I've got a distinction here between what I've called NEPA, so non-exercise physical activity. This is just sort of, this is maybe sort of non-purposeful exercise. This might just be walking around, doing a bit of gardening, washing dishes, whatever. Just being up on your feet burns calories. And then we can put in our sort of more purposeful planned exercises. We've got this concept of the thermic effect of feeding. So food requires a certain amount of calories to actually digest it. So you look at some proteins, they take a bit of breaking down, particularly, where some foods are just very easily broken down. So lots of sort of sugary stuff, things like a Haribo from the previous slide. Our bodies hardly need any sort of work to actually digest it and move it through our gut. So that requires very little sort of energy input. And then I've just got other, so very generally. So, there's times, so certain illnesses, sort of hormonal statuses cause our cells to burn more calories. Our immune system might sort of require more energy for a short period of time. So, but generally we sort of break down our energy expenditure to what is our sort of set metabolic rate, the activity we do, and the sort of the calories required to sort of break down and digest our food. So this is a sort of a complex looking slide, and I'm only going to show the concepts very, very briefly, because they're incredibly complex things. If we wanted to actually measure how many calories you burn, so sometimes you have these treadmills and they sort of say, how many calories you've burnt by doing a kilometer, and you get to your kilometer and you say, that's great, I've done 100 calories, and you say that's enough to burn 2 fingers of Kit Kat, whatever. These has to be guesses. So there's 2 ways of really scientifically measuring energy expenditure. On the left hand side, we've got this concept of direct calorimetry. Now, if you remember at the start, the definition of a calorie was the amount of energy required to raise 1 gram of water by 1 degree, and a kilocalorie was the amount of energy required to raise 1 kilo or 1 litre of water by 1 degree. If we want to measure the amount of calories someone is burning, what we need to do is kind of stick them in a chamber and measure their heat. So what's going on in this left hand side, on this left picture, is we've got a guy on a cycle. So this is our man. I'll sort of put his head in yellow if I can. Can I do that? There we are. Not really. So we've got this guy here, and he's exercising. Now you know that when you exercise, you create heat. Muscle contraction is a fairly inefficient business. So when you use energy to create muscle contraction, heat is lost. So that heat is lost into the atmosphere. So if we're working super hard, then we create lots of heat and we expel lots of that heat into the atmosphere. Now all that heat will rise, and what it will do, it here heats up this water that's held in these copper pipes here. I'm just sort of covering them in blue. So the harder you work, the more you heat up the water in those hot copper pipes, and the more energy you are shown to have expelled. It's such a complex thing to be able to do. I've tried to sort of summarize very briefly how it might work, but you can imagine that to do that, to get a completely sealed room, to measure just minute changes in temperature, whilst also keeping other things like air in and air out temperature at a constant, is an incredibly specialized concept. So more commonly used is this concept of indirect calorimetry. So this is where, again, you kind of estimate calories burnt by measuring the gas that you breathe out effectively. So all air that we breathe in is roughly 21% oxygen, and we breathe out around 16% oxygen. So the ratio between the oxygen you breathe in and the carbon dioxide you breathe out is used to estimate what sort of energy substrates you're using. So the harder you're working, the more carbon dioxide you create, the more glycogen you're shown to be using. So from these calculations, your energy usage is estimated. So effectively, by monitoring the amount of carbon dioxide breathed out relative to the concentration of the oxygen you breathe in, there is an estimation made of the amount of fuel that you're using. So from that calculation, again, you can imagine this is a hugely complex field of study. So from that calculation, your calorie usage is estimated. So again, you can see this guy, he's having all his gas, everything he breathes in and everything he breathes out, analysed. So where we sort of estimate that maybe a footballer might burn 800 calories per match or something similar to that, it's a wild guess. It's just such a, you just can't estimate it at all. It's a very difficult sort of concept to deal with. So broadly speaking, in summary, direct calorimetry estimates your energy usage in calories or kilocalories by measuring what heat you produce when you exercise. Indirect calorimetry estimates the amount of calories that you use during exercise by creating a calculation from your oxygen usage to estimate which energy substrate, i.e. which fuel you're using and how much of that fuel, and from that estimation it sort of estimates your total calorie usage. So we move on to a little section, just again sort of expanding on what energy is in our macronutrients. So generally the NHS recommends that we as men take in 2,500 calories a day and women 2,000 calories a day. So obviously this is again a sort of fairly wild estimation. A sort of 5'1" man who weighs 7 stone is not going to require more calories than a 15 stone woman who's a elite athlete, let's say an elite rugby player, who spends a day training twice a day and is packed full of muscle. So they're sort of wild estimations for the general population. So as sports scientists, we'll hopefully sort of be able to refine that figure and look at ways where we can estimate energy requirements in a much more sort of refined, considered way. What doesn't change is how many calories come from each macronutrient. So carbohydrate gives roughly 4 calories per gram, regardless of whether that's from a starchy carbohydrate or a very sweet sort of sugary carbohydrate. So it's just per calories per gram. But what you'll find is where you've got very sweet carbohydrate, the energy is much denser. So think about something like a handful of Haribo. It's quite a dense way of packing energy together, isn't it, in that sort of sweet form. Whereas if you've got something like pasta, for example, you've got a handful of dried pasta, per gram the energy is the same, but just that sort of volume is much greater. Fat, 9 calories per gram, and that again doesn't sort of discriminate to whether it's fat you get from sort of bacon rind or whether it's olive oil. It's all calories. So whilst something like olive oil might be quite a healthy fat, smothering on everything will still raise the calorie content of a meal. And lastly, protein is sort of estimated at 4 calories per gram. I think it's quite hard to estimate actually, because sometimes it has sort of slightly harder pathways to be digested, and the energy usage from protein is a little bit less sort of easy to estimate. But generally we think about protein as being 4 calories per gram. So again, sort of overdoing protein shakes, overeating sort of protein, sort of tuna and chicken on the sort of thought that it's always good. It still has a calorie load to it. So excess protein does ultimately get converted into glucose and then sort of used by the body or taken up into our fat stores. Okay, so I sort of posed the question, and I've sort of written in the answers in the interim. So the question was, what percentage of a 2,500 calorie diet would this Big Mac and large fries represent? So in green, I've put the total calories from a Big Mac, 540, and from a large fries, 444. So the total is 984. So if you take 984 and divide that by the 2,500, and then multiply that figure by 100, you end up with 39.4. So quite a, it's a significant chunk of someone's daily calorie requirements met by, a Big Mac and fries. So in red, I've got the total number of calories from fat. So 30 grams of fat in a Big Mac, 22 grams of fat in that sort of portion of large fries. It's quite interesting how close they are in terms of total calories from the fries and the Big Mac itself, actually. So that's 52 calories of 52 grams of fat overall. So remember, 1 gram of fat is equivalent to 9 calories. So you times 52 by 9, and you end up with 468. And then the last question is, what extra calories would you add if you add a shake? I can't remember off the top of my head. It's something like about 4. I think we looked at the start, didn't we? Something like about 400 something calories. So you'd nudge probably over 50% of someone's total calorie needs by sort of supersizing your Big Mac. So long term, we talk about this concept of energy balance. So this sort of picture on the right hand side sort of shows that if we balance, our calories eaten on this side balances our calories burnt on this side, our weight will tend to sort of stay about the same level. It's a little bit, it doesn't really take into account the person's sort of whether their muscles are in a state of growing or actually sort of atrophying and wasting. If you can imagine, if you were a sort of very active person and suddenly caused to have a very long layoff, your calorie requirements are going to be very, very low because you've got all this sort of stored energy in this muscle, which essentially, maybe if you can't maintain it, it's going to be wasting away a fair bit. So it's a slightly more sort of subtle calculation than is presented here, but generally we this sort of second picture is relatively easy to understand. If we eat loads of calories here, more than we burn, we tend to gain weight, and equally if we burn far more calories than we eat, we tend to lose weight. So as a fairly simple concept. Generally, a pound of fat, i.e. about 454 grams, is equivalent to, well, you can do the calculation. So if you calculate 454 grams, so how many calories is that likely to be? Just have an estimation in your head. So you've got 454, and you multiply that by 9, which will come up with 4,086 calories. So theoretically, that sort of calorie in, calorie out model means that if you want to if you're going to put on a pound of fat, let's say you've got a big Christmas day, and you sort of come out and say, "Oh, I'll put on 3 pounds during that day." Well, yeah, to put on 3 pounds of fat, you'd have to overeat by over 12,000 calories. So the second sort of tick I've got on the side. Tracking body fat percentage changes allows you to determine whether weight gain or weight loss is due to fat-free mass, i.e. muscle, or fat mass. So other things that would include that fat-free mass might include bone. So exercising causes us to lay down more calcium in our bones. We tend to get thicker bones. Ligaments, tendons all thicken up. So fat-free mass is a good thing to have from an athletic perspective. It generally sort of shows a healthy body. So we pose the question here, if an 80 kilo man is 18% body fat, how much does his body fat weigh? So that's your question number 1. And the second question is, how many kilos of fat will he lose if his weight drops to 79 kilos, but his body fat drops to 14%. So I want you to spend a couple of minutes just thinking about that question and trying to calculate your answer. So you'll need to pause the presentation and just work through that. So think about how much that 18% is of that 80 kilos. So work out 1% of 80 kilos, times it by 18. So I'm just going to move over to the next page. Should have the answers. There we are. So if an 80 kilo man is 18% body fat, how much does his body fat weigh? Well, to calculate it, I've taken 1% of 80 kilos. So that is 0.8 kilograms. So just divide 80 kilos by 100. I then times that by 18. So 0.8 times 18 comes up with, so 18% of 80 kilos is 14.4 kilos. So his fat mass is 14.4 kilos. So his fat-free mass is everything else. So this could include things like blood, muscle, bone, his internal organs, his digestive system, teeth, eyes, everything. So it's not like if we take the fat mass, everything else is muscle, but it's generally a good indicator. So we try and sort of use this fat versus fat-free mass. So I've put a little reminder here that 1 gram of fat is 9 calories. So that means 1,000 grams, i.e. a kilo, is equivalent to has sort of enough energy for 9,000 calories. So we can imagine he's got a lot of energy in him, hasn't he? 14.4 kilos, that's not much fat. But our fat stores are a very efficient way of storing our energy. So the next little question I gave you was how many kilos of fat will he lose if his weight drops to 79 kilos, but his body fat drops to 14? So only a 1 kilo loss in weight, but a 4% drop in body fat percentage. So 1% of 79 kilos is 0.79. So 79 divided by 100. We times that by 14 and we come up with 11.06. So his 14% of fat is now is weighing only 11.06 kilos. So his total fat loss is 3.34 kilos. So he has actually lost 1 kilo of total weight, but actually he's lost 3.3 kilos of fat. So how did that happen? What you have here is someone who's lost very little weight overall, because they're dropping fat on one side, but their muscle and their lean tissue is increasing on the other side. So if you become fitter, let's say you've got someone who gains muscle, they'll gain sort of more protein gets laid down into muscle, ligaments get thicker, tendons get thicker. By becoming more aerobically fit, you actually get slightly more blood, so that has a weight cost as well. So everything adds. So here we've got quite a nice way of monitoring the quality of someone's weight loss, and really it's quite a nice way of coaching people as well. If you're a trainer, a personal trainer, for example, someone's saying, I'm not losing any weight, you can say, well, actually, you've lost very little weight overall, but what you have done is you've lost fat and you've gained fat-free mass, which is a good thing. So that concept of fat versus fat-free mass is sort of shown nicely on these two pictures. On the left-hand side, I've got a 40-year-old triathlete. Now, this is someone's thigh. They've cut in the middle of the thigh, or sort of a scan across the middle of a thigh, sort of looking top down. And what you can see here is, in this top picture, I'm just colouring it in yellow, is you've got this is all muscle. So this is nice sort of thick muscle. It's a 40-year-old person, and that little white section, I'll just sort of colour that in green, that little white section there is their fat. So they're subcutaneous fat, so fat that's just held just underneath the skin. In the middle, I'm going to colour it in a purple. You can see their bone. Now if you go to the picture below, you've got a 74-year-old sedentary person, so someone who doesn't exercise, and if you look at the width of that bone in the middle, can you see how much thinner that is? You then look at the yellow space for that muscle. This is the dark bit here. I can't even colour it in yellow because it's so dark and sort of stringy. You then look at the subcutaneous fat, that sort of adipose tissue all around that muscle. So as a sort of body, this is a very high high percentage of body fat, even if it's actually probably quite a light person. The interesting thing is if you contrast it to the bottom, you've got a 74-year-old triathlete, and look how well maintained their bone is. I'm just putting that in purple now, and look at how well maintained their muscle is, which is amazing. So our healthy body composition, if we go to this right hand side, on the top here we've got about 45% muscle, 3% essential fat. So this is sort of fat held within our body. This could be in our central nervous system. It sort of insulates nerves and the like. Lots of cell membranes have got a little bit of fat in them. You know, we can't live without fat. We need it to transport certain vitamins and minerals, more vitamins. We've got non-essential fat, so sort of fat that's held subcutaneously under our skin or sort of wrapped around our organs when it becomes excessive. We've got bone, and then we've also got our other sort of organs, our internal digestive system, etc. So when we measure body composition, the thing that we're usually most interested in is that relationship between fat and fat-free mass. So one of the key determinants, or one of the potential determinants of our sort of ability to put on muscle and lose fat, or vice versa, is this concept of our somatotype. So our somatotype is our sort of essential body shape, and it's kind of on a spectrum. On the left-hand side, we've got our endomorphs, and endomorphs are a bit like this chap on the bottom here. So he is a classic endomorph shape. So a sort of quite thick-necked, sort of thick-waisted, barrel-chested sort of chap with relatively short limbs. So these short limbs make acceleration quite good. You know, you can get good power output from those short levers. So these people make good sort of Olympic weightlifters with these little levers. They can pack on muscle. They find it relatively easy to build muscle. They've got a very low centre of gravity, so again, really helpful in things like Olympic weightlifting. We've got a prop forward here who really has to get down to bind low. Very difficult to tackle him if you're in rugby because you have to get so low and sort of to get below that sort of centre of gravity. But they do put on fat very easily, or tend to put it on very easily, and that's the downside of being an endomorph. On the opposite side, we've got these ectomorphs. So we've got the sort of high jumper on the top. They have a much higher centre of gravity, where they're sort of where they've got these very long limbs. The long limbs make things like weightlifting relatively difficult because you've got such sort of long levers. It means that they, in terms of things like acceleration, can be slightly slower. You need a lot of muscle packed on to make that acceleration happen. But actually things like top speed is usually pretty good because you've got these nice long levers, often very efficient runners. So they've got these slim hips, which means is a really sort of classic runner's physique. Very sort of efficient, very sort of energy efficient sort of movement sort of capacity. They find it very difficult to put on large amounts of muscle. So again, they're efficient movers. They have a high centre of gravity, long limbs, which classic sort of basketball players are all sort of these sort of big ectomorphs, but actually a lot of them are sort of becoming sort of fairly muscular. So it's not an exact you are an ectomorph or an endomorph. You can be ectomorph with a sort of mesomorphic edge. So lots of the lots of basketball players are sort of very muscular, so they're not sort of like a pure ectomorph like this sort of this high jumper in the middle. The mesomorph is the one in the middle. So most footballers would probably sort of, generally sort of maybe someone like Peter Crouch is a classic ectomorph, but a lot of footballers are sort of classic mesomorphs. If you looked at a rugby team, the sort of fly half is going to be a sort of mesomorph. Sorry, the centres are going to be a mesomorph. In basketball, again, the centre, the person in the middle, sort of dictating play, is usually mesomorphic because they've got a sort of happy balance. They are able to pack on muscle well. They find fat loss relatively easy. They're sort of relatively low centre of gravity. It makes agility relatively easy. It makes acceleration relatively easy due to their limb length as well. What that doesn't tell you is exactly body composition, but it does hint that someone who's endomorphic tends to lay down more fat mass more easily, and an ectomorph tends to have a sort of a greater difficulty in laying down new muscle. So we have a few methods to measure body fat percentage. I'm going to go through them one by one. Again, you'll have done a sort of fitness testing unit, so this is almost just a quick recap, really. So what we've got here is skinfold calipers. So they sort of work on the basis that around 50% of your fat is held under the skin, sort of subcutaneously. You measure 4 sites usually, but there are sort of versions of this where you measure much more sites. You essentially take a pinch of the skin. The calipers measure the width of that pinch, so that the sort of fat width in millimeters. You total the number of millimeters you record, and then you add it into a table. So for example here, let's say I am using a 45 to 49-year-old man. Let's say their skin folds totaled 35 millimeters. That makes them 19.6% body fat. So nice and simple. It can be quite accurate if you've had enough expertise in doing it. Can be a little bit invasive if you're sort of dealing with certain client groups. So if you're very obese, you possibly don't want someone sort of poking around you. It can be quite sort of invasive. It doesn't feel comfortable. So use with caution. It's generally being used much less and less in gyms now, but it is a nice skill to have. You can really, as a sort of professional, you can get really skilled in using them, and you can sort of provide more individual feedback. You can sort of say, well, that maybe sort of the tricep skin fold is getting much less relative to the waist version, and it's been suggested you can use different skin fold measurements to predict different sort of hormonal imbalances. So it can go quite deep, but for our purposes, we just use it as a fairly simple body fat percentage assessor. Bioelectrical impedance is probably the most commonly used, certainly in sort of fitness environments now. So basically, this person here has got a sort of handheld one. You can stand on versions. You can have versions where you stand on and hold something. You can have versions where they sort of clip something onto your hand and your leg. Or there's various versions. So basically, they all work on the same principle. You send an electric current around the body, and the speed at which that current travels around the body is monitored by the machine. If you're very muscular, most of you have a relatively high water content in your muscles, so that impulse is going to travel around you more quickly. You have less impedance to that electrical impulse. So if you add in your weight, your height, and other details such as your age, it makes a prediction on of your body fat percentage based on how quick that impulse is traveling around your body, i.e. how little resistance there is to its flow. If you're very fat, if your muscles are sort of full of fat, if your organs, you've got all this sort of visceral fat, that impulse will be slowed down on its journey and will return to the machine much more slowly. So it will calculate that and think, this is a fatty. So this last method, this is a funny one actually. You just don't see it so much now. It works on the Archimedes principle. So Archimedes sat in a bath that was full, and he realized that, or he had a eureka moment, because he realized that actually the volume of water that was displaced was equivalent to the volume of water that went into that bath. So if you've got a completely flat bath, you know, it's full to the brim of water, and you throw, let's say, I don't know, say a can of Coke that you haven't opened into that bath, what comes out of that bath, the volume is going to be equivalent to the volume of that can of Coke. There. So what you're doing with, I can point, what you're doing up here in this bath is this person's being underwater weighted. So he's being sort of dipped into a bath, and what you can see is there's a little sort of exit on that little bath he's being dipped into. So as he's dipped in, the volume of water displaced is measured. So we get an indicator of how much volume that person takes up. So someone who's huge is obviously going to displace a large amount of water. He's also, you can see up there, being weighed. So someone who's fairly, let's say fairly fat relative to their volume, generally floats a little bit more in water. So by understanding how much volume he's displaced and how much he weighs in water, an estimation is made of his whole sort of body density, and in turn an estimation is made of his body fat percentage. As you can imagine, this is a very time-consuming process. The most common way the principles are used now are with these bod pods, which work on a very similar principle in that you seal yourself into a sort of pod, and it calculates the amount of sort of air that you displace by being inside that pod. It weighs you, and it makes a almost kind of, well, it is an automatic calculation of your body fat percentage. So these are what are widely used in sort of professional sport these days. They cost about £50,000, but they're pretty accurate. They're sort of fairly non-invasive. They're pretty simple to operate, or they need sort of recalibrating fairly regularly.